Okay, so you want to own a Starbucks, prime corner location, line out the door every morning, the most recognizable logo in the world doing your marketing for you. Buy the franchise, hire some baristas, watch the money roll in. Here's the strange part, you can't. Not because you don't have the money, not because you don't qualify. Starbucks does not sell franchises in the United States or Canada. Not for $100,000, not for 10 million. If you've ever wondered how to franchise a Starbucks, the honest answer is that the option simply doesn't exist, and it never has. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why the biggest coffee company on earth refuses to let anyone franchise it, what the one narrow legal workaround actually costs and pays, why the company nearly collapsed under its own weight over the last 2 years, and what the new CEO's $100 million turnaround plan reveals about who this business really works for. So, if you can't buy a franchise, what's actually for sale? This is the part almost everyone gets wrong when they start Googling Starbucks franchise cost. Unlike McDonald's, Dunkin, or Subway, Starbucks has never operated as a traditional franchise system in its home market. Nearly all of its roughly 20,000 North American stores fall into one of two categories: company-owned, run directly by Starbucks corporate, or licensed, run by an approved outside operator under an extremely tight set of rules. As of the most recent count, just under half of all U.S. locations are licensed. The rest belong entirely to the corporation. Here's why that distinction actually matters. A franchise gives you a business in a box: brand, training, supply chain, but real operational independence. You set some of your own policies, hire your own way, and the franchisor mostly cares that checks clear and standards are loosely met. A license is a completely different arrangement. Starbucks tells you exactly what equipment to install, exactly how the menu is built, exactly how baristas are trained, and retains the right to inspect and correct almost anything about how the store runs day to day. You're not buying independence. You're buying permission to operate someone else's business inside your building. So, who actually qualifies for one of these licenses? Not first-time entrepreneurs. Starbucks licensing is built for people who already own a location Starbucks wants to be inside of: a grocery store chain, an airport concession operator, a university dining service, a hospital system. The financial bar alone eliminates almost everyone who's ever daydreamed about opening one. You typically need liquid capital of around $700,000, a net worth approaching $1 million, and an initial investment that can run anywhere from $315,000 to over $1 million once real estate and build-out are included. And after clearing all of that, here's the part that explains everything else about this arrangement. You're not actually buying a Starbucks. You're renting the right to operate one, on Starbucks terms, inside a business you already had to own before they'd even consider you. And the moment your location stops serving Starbucks' strategic interest, that permission can end. That's not a minor technicality. It's the entire design. Compare it to Chick-fil-A, which runs on a similarly tight control model. Operators put up a comparatively tiny amount of capital. But in exchange, Chick-fil-A owns the real estate, controls nearly every operational decision, and takes the majority of the profit. Starbucks' licensing model sits even further toward corporate control, because unlike Chick-fil-A's single-unit operators, Starbucks licensees are almost always big, well-capitalized companies operating many locations at once, embedded inside institutions Starbucks needs but doesn't want to build alone: airport terminals, campus dining halls, grocery store vestibules. The pattern gets even more pronounced outside North America. Internationally, Starbucks leans on a small number of enormous regional partners instead of thousands of small operators. In the Middle East, that partner is the Al Shaya Group, a Kuwaiti conglomerate that runs hundreds of Starbucks locations across multiple countries under a single master license. In India, it's a joint venture with the Tata Group, one of the country's largest business houses. These aren't mom-and-pop franchisees signing individual contracts. They're some of the largest private companies in their respective regions, chosen specifically because they already have the capital, the real estate relationships, and the institutional weight to expand Starbucks at national scale without the company managing thousands of individual relationships itself. So, what does a licensed location actually earn? A single licensed Starbucks generates roughly $1.2 million in annual revenue on average. After paying licensing fees, royalties, staff, and operating costs back to the corporation, the operator typically nets somewhere between $50,000 and $200,000 in profit per location per year. Operators who run 20 or more locations, the airport concession giants, the grocery chains, can clear $2 million a year or more across their portfolio. For an individual with one license, that's a real business, but a modest one relative to the upfront capital required. For an institutional operator running dozens, it's a genuinely lucrative side business bolted onto an existing operation. Walk the math on a single average location. On $1.2 million in annual revenue, licensing fees and ongoing royalties to Starbucks typically consume a meaningful double-digit percentage before a single barista is paid. Layer on staffing, which in food service usually runs another 25 to 30% of revenue, then rent, equipment maintenance, and required brand standard renovations Starbucks can mandate at will. What's left on the high end might be $200,000. On a slow location in a bad year, it can compress toward the bottom of that range or lower. Compare that to a McDonald's franchise, where a single unit can net well over triple that in profit. And you start to see why the people actually buying into the Starbucks system are almost never individuals chasing the McDonald's-style franchise dream. They're already large operators adding a recognizable brand to real estate they control for other reasons. Now here's the part almost nobody outside the industry was watching, and it's the reason this video exists right now instead of 5 years ago. Starbucks, the company that built its entire identity on premium coffee and consistent experience, spent 2024 and 2025 falling apart from the inside, and it had almost nothing to do with coffee. Same-store sales in North America fell for 6 consecutive quarters, not one bad quarter, 6 in a row. Customers who'd normalized $5 lattes during good economic years started treating Starbucks the way people treat any discretionary purchase during a squeeze. The first thing cut when gas prices rise and grocery bills climb. The company's own executives openly acknowledged the brand had drifted. Mobile ordering, meant to add convenience, had instead stripped away the third-place feeling Starbucks spent decades building. The reason people were willing to pay $4 for coffee they could make at home for 30 cents. In September 2024, the board brought in Brian Niccol, the executive who'd previously turned around both Taco Bell and Chipotle, to fix it. His total compensation package for that first year, $95.8 million. To put that number into perspective, that's roughly 6,600 times what the average Starbucks barista earns in a year. At the time, the single largest CEO-to-worker pay gap of any company in the S&P 500. The turnaround plan that followed was called, without much subtlety, Back to Starbucks. Simplify the menu, speed up order times, restore in-store ambiance, and close the stores that weren't working. In September 2025, Starbucks announced it would shut down roughly 400 underperforming stores across North America, about 1% of its footprint, as part of a billion-dollar restructuring plan. 900 corporate employees lost their jobs in that round, on top of 1,100 corporate layoffs earlier the same year. The stock had already dropped around 9% for the year by the time the closures were announced. Shareholders were unhappy enough that Starbucks faced a lawsuit over what they called a surprise sales decline that management had allegedly downplayed. Here's the part that connects directly back to everything explained earlier in this video. Every one of those 400 closures, every one of those 2,000 layoffs, happened entirely within Starbucks' own company-owned structure. Decisions made unilaterally at corporate headquarters with zero input required from any outside operator because there essentially are none in the traditional sense. That's not incidental. That's the entire point of refusing to franchise in the first place. When a McDonald's franchisee's store underperforms, that's a negotiation between two separate businesses. When a company-owned Starbucks underperforms, it's simply a decision, no negotiation required. The same structure explains why Starbucks' labor fight has been so unusually direct and so unusually long. Baristas first voted to unionize at a single store in Buffalo, New York in December 2021. By the end of 2025, that had grown to 667 unionized stores, representing about 6% of Starbucks company-owned U.S. locations. And after 4 full years, not one of those stores had a finalized contract. In November 2025, more than 1,000 union baristas launched what the union called the Red Cup Rebellion, an open-ended strike beginning at 65 stores across more than 40 cities on one of the company's biggest promotional days of the year. It became the longest strike in Starbucks history, running 131 days before both sides agreed to resume negotiations. Separately, the company agreed to pay $38 million to settle claims that it violated fair scheduling laws affecting workers' hours. Notice what's absent from that entire fight. Any franchisee caught in the middle, because there's no independent ownership layer standing between corporate and the barista behind the register. Every labor dispute, every strike, every settlement lands as a direct, unfiltered confrontation between the company and its own workforce. With no buffer, no local owner to blame, and no separate business entity to absorb the reputational hit. The same centralization that let Starbucks close 400 stores with a single memo is the same centralization that puts its own name directly on every picket line. So, did the turnaround actually work? Slowly and unevenly, yes. By the quarter ending late December 2025, global comparable sales were up 4%, driven by a 3% rise in transactions. China, a market that had been struggling separately, posted 7% growth. Starbucks opened 128 new stores that quarter alone, ending the period with just over 41,000 locations worldwide. Management raised its full-year same-store sales growth outlook to 5% or better going into 2026. Niccol's own compensation dropped sharply to $31 million for fiscal 2025. Still enormous, but a fraction of the prior year's number, and the company framed it as pay finally reconnecting with performance instead of a transition bonus. But the turnaround has run into a second obstacle that has nothing to do with menus or store design, the cost of coffee itself. Green coffee prices have been running nearly $1 per pound above year-ago levels, and new tariff pressures have added further strain, right as the company was trying to prove its cost discipline. Analysts who'd initially expected the turnaround to show clear results by early 2025 pushed their timeline back repeatedly, now landing somewhere in early to mid-2026. A full turnaround taking roughly twice as long as first predicted. So, what does this actually look like at different scales? A single licensed operator, say a grocery chain running a handful of in-store Starbucks counters, experiences almost none of this drama directly. Their revenue is contractually tied to store-level performance and Starbucks' national brand health, but they have zero exposure to corporate layoffs, zero say in the turnaround strategy, zero exposure to the union fight since licensed locations are typically staffed and managed by the host business rather than Starbucks corporate, and zero ability to influence whether 400 company-owned stores close around the country. They're renters in someone else's economic weather system, insulated from the boardroom entirely. Their biggest risk is narrow and local. Does this specific airport terminal or grocery store keep enough foot traffic to justify the license fee, regardless of what's happening at headquarters 2,000 miles away? Starbucks Corporation itself lives at the opposite extreme. Every one of those 6 quarters of declining sales, every store closure, every layoff, every dollar of coffee cost inflation, every strike, every labor settlement lands directly on one balance sheet because there's no network of independent franchisees to absorb or distribute that risk. A McDonald-style franchise system spreads bad news across thousands of separate small business owners, each managing their own local reality and absorbing their own local downturn. Starbucks' refusal to franchise means it also refuses to spread that risk. When things are good, the company keeps nearly all of the upside, the full $1.2 million in average per store revenue, minus only the modest licensing cut paid out to operators. When things go bad, 6 quarters in a row, a $100 million executive pay package under scrutiny, a 4-year-old union fight boiling into the longest strike in company history, it absorbs the entire downside alone too, in full public view, with nowhere to distribute the blame. So, if you were hoping to own a piece of Starbucks the way you might own a McDonald's or a Dunkin, understand what you're actually being offered, if you're offered anything at all. You're not buying a franchise because Starbucks decided decades ago that franchising meant surrendering the exact control that makes the brand worth anything. What you can buy, if you already qualify, is a tightly supervised license to operate someone else's business inside your own, keeping a modest slice of the profit in exchange for none of the strategic control, while the company itself keeps total control and absorbs the full weight of every bad quarter, every executive pay controversy, every labor strike, and every billion-dollar restructuring alone. Howard Schultz said it plainly back when the company was still small enough to justify the choice. Franchising would have meant handing the brand experience to people who might interpret it differently at every location. Decades and 41,000 stores later, that same logic still governs a company that size, which is exactly why one bad 2 years could hit every one of those stores' financial results simultaneously, with no independent owner anywhere in the system to blame, negotiate with, or lean on. The dream of owning a Starbucks was never actually for sale. What's for sale is the right to stand behind the counter of a business you'll never actually own. It's Tuesday,